Discerning the Book of Revelation, the Seventh Seal, the Seven Trumpets, Part 6. We begin by reviewing the main points from our last study. Jesus Christ introduced the term the times of the Gentiles. This period began after Jerusalem and the Temple were destroyed in 70 AD, and Emperor Hadrian renamed Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina in 129 AD. He also banished the Jews from Jerusalem after their last revolt that happened between 132 and 135 AD. The destruction of the Temple and Jerusalem and the banishment of the Jews from Jerusalem fulfilled what God told Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 9, what would happen if they disobey God. Jesus Christ told his disciples before he ascended to heaven to escape to the mountains when they see Jerusalem surrounded by an army. These first Christians fled to Pella, a mountainous area north of Jerusalem. Jesus Christ also revealed to John the defeat and ousting of Satan from heaven. They were thrown down to earth. Jesus Christ revealed to John in his vision of the woman, which represents the church. The rule of the Gentiles ushered in the church. Remember, the church is no longer Jewish but made up of Gentiles. This was a woman that John saw in the heavenly vision that Satan was going after to destroy. In Ephesians 2 verse 2, the Apostle Paul called Satan the prince of the power of the air. After they were thrown out of heaven to earth, they hang out in the space or air. They actually form a constellation of stars in the universe named serpents. This constellation has the shape of a snake. We begin this segment by examining the beast that John saw as he was standing on the sand of the sea. John is now seeing this vision on earth as opposed to the heavenly vision that he had in our last study. Revelation 13 verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Let's examine what these symbols mean. The sea, the 7 heads, the 10 horns, and the name of blasphemy written on each head. As used in the previous studies, the symbolic meaning of sea in the book of Revelation is peoples or nations. John saw this beast coming out of nations and peoples. Here are 2 verses that use the word sea as symbols for peoples or nations. The background of Daniel 7 verse 3 was when he dreamt of the 4 beasts. Daniel 7 verse 3. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. Then in Jeremiah 49 verse 23, concerning Damascus, Hamath is confounded, and Arpad, for they have heard evil tidings. They are faint-hearted. There is sorrow on the sea. It cannot be quiet. The context of this verse was about the judgment of Damascus in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Again, you can replace the sea for peoples and nations. The 7 heads, which we already identified in our last study, were symbolic for the 7 hills of Rome. So we know this beast is the Roman Empire. As for the 10 horns with crowns and the name of blasphemy, we will look at that shortly in this study. First, let's look at the similarities and differences between the dragon and the beast. Both have 7 heads and 10 horns. The difference is on the number of crowns and their placement. The crowns on the dragon was on the 7 heads, which I presented as the 7 Caesars of the Roman Empire, beginning with Julius Caesar up to Vespasian, who was the emperor of Rome when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. The beast, however, has 10 crowns, and these crowns were placed on the 10 horns. Also note that John saw the dragon in heaven, or sky, while the beast came up out of peoples or nations, which means John saw him on earth. Let's look even closer at this beast to see what other important information we can gather about this beast that came out of peoples or nations. Revelation 13 verse 2. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat and great authority. Do you remember this image that Daniel recorded in Daniel 7 verses 2 to 7 out of his dream from our previous study? These were the 4 kingdoms that God showed Daniel that came in the form of beasts or animals. From the left, the lion was the Babylonian Empire. The bear was a medo-persian. The leopard with wings was the Greek-Macedonian Empire. And the beast with 10 horns was the Roman Empire. The image in Revelation 13, which you're seeing on the slide, was the accumulative image of these 4 beasts that Daniel saw in his dream in Daniel chapter 7. This was in our previous study. The beast in Revelation 13 has the body of a leopard, and this represents the Greek-Macedonian Empire. The feet were like the feet of a bear, and these represent the Medo-Persian Empire. The mouth was as the mouth of a lion, and this represents the Babylonian Empire. And the 10 horns represent the Roman Empire. It is logical to think that when a new empire or kingdom arises, it picks up the traits of the previous or past empires. What this image suggests is that as the last ordained kingdom, it is a culmination or zenith of all man's kingdoms. You may also think that this beast was a 5th kingdom. Not at all. God only ordained 4 kingdoms as showed in Daniel chapters 2 and 7. If you remember in our previous study that I presented the idea that the Roman Empire has not died or ended, this beast represented the Roman Empire. The last part of the verse states that the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. It means that Satan has fully invested himself on this last kingdom. In Daniel's dream in the book of Daniel chapter 7 verse 7, Daniel described the 4th beast. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Daniel noted that this beast was different because it had 10 horns. The horn as used in the Old Testament scriptures represents power. For example, in Jeremiah 48 verse 25, the Lord God told Jeremiah, quote, "The horn of Moab is cut off, and his arm is broken, saith the Lord," unquote. The context of this verse was the judgment of Moab. There are other scriptures that use horn as a symbol of power. Before we proceed to identify these 10 horns, let us first take a moment to remind ourselves how this beast came to being. In our last study, Jesus Christ showed the Apostle John how Satan got to earth in Revelation 12 verses 7 to 9. It was when Satan and his angels lost the war to Michael and his angels, and they were cast down to earth. Satan and his demons are here on earth, masqueraded or cloaked behind the powers or rulers or governments. And Satan was behind the power of the Roman Empire, whom Satan gave his power, his seat, and authority, as written in Revelation 13, verse 2. This time, Satan, or the serpent, was out to destroy the woman, or the church. Revelation 12, verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child. Revelation 12, verse 14. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place where she is nourished, for a time and times and a half a time, from the face of the serpent. Clearly, this is a metaphor for the time when God protected the woman from Satan, who was ready to devour her. The word nourished is the operative word in this verse. The word nourish in Greek is trepo, and it means strengthened. This word came from the base word trope, which is the idea of convolution. The word convolution means to turn or revolution. When we think of revolution, we normally associate this to upheaval or alteration. In this case, the use of the word nourish is not simply to feed, but it is used in a figurative manner. We will see later how this verse fits in according to written history. The period for a time and times and a half time is certainly about a period of time, and it relates to season or a while. However, there's no other indication for me to suggest any meaning to this time frame at this point. Let's look at what history records with regards to the persecution of Christians. Imperial persecutions of Christians in Rome began in 64 AD, when Nero was the emperor. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire that burned a third of Rome. This was a major turn of events for Christians in Rome. This was when a wholesale persecution of Christians started under Nero. Rumors among ancient historians pointed to Nero as the instigator of the fire, or the Jews in Rome, to cause troubles for the Christians, because the Jews were jealous that Christians were growing in numbers. One of the ways Christians were persecuted and killed was being fed to lions. They became the spectacle in the Roman Colosseum as part of the emperor's entertainment. Another was being burned on a stake or a pole as torches at night's events. You can refer to the book entitled Fox's Book of Martyrs, written by John Fox, to get an understanding of what happened to the early Christians and the first 1,000 years of church existence. Moving on to Revelation 12, verse 15. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. We read in 2 Samuel 22, verse 5, the word flood is used by David when he described how he felt against his enemies. David wrote, quote, "When the waves of death compassed me, the floods of ungodly men made me afraid," unquote. In this verse, David described the overwhelming fear he felt because of his enemies. In this case, the word flood in Revelation 12, verse 15, is used to describe the power used by Satan as overwhelming, overpowering, or engulfing. And this was the literal meaning of the flood, or the overwhelming power of Satan that he unleashed on Christians. The beast, which was the Roman Empire, persecuted Christians for about 2.5 centuries, beginning with Nero in 64 AD to Diocletian in 303 AD. Christians were targeted en masse, or as a group. Historians believe that these were the 10 greatest persecutions of Christians. These emperors represent the 10 horns with crowns on the beast. To check this part of Christian history, please go to the link shown at the bottom of the slide. And with regards to the name of blasphemy which was on the 7 heads in Revelation 13 verse 1, it is not clear what this name was. In Revelation 17 verse 3, the same beasts have many names of blasphemy. Revelation 17 verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Accordingly, it appears that the names have multiplied on the same beast. In this case, I will not make any conjecture about this subject. Revelation 12 verse 16, and the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood, which the dragon cast out of his mouth. The swallowing up of the flood by the earth means the flood subsided. As noted earlier, the word earth in Greek has several meanings. It means country, ground, land, and world. Since the word earth is related to the physical world we see, I believe this metaphor was related to a major event on earth, which we will see in our next study. We will end this study with this verse, Revelation 12 verse 17. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he, John, stood on the sand of the sea. This verse clearly states that the war on earth between Satan and the followers of Jesus Christ is continuing on. The evil that is going on in this world is the work of Satan. Jesus Christ is showing this to us in this book. On the contrary, Satan does not want us to see his works. This is another reason that John, the writer of the book, told us that those who study this book are blessed, because we become aware of the spiritual forces against us. It is important to know that the world we live in is a battleground, and we must be equipped and reminded always, so we will not fall to Satan's schemes. If we do not understand the presence and power of Satan in this world, then we are walking blindly on this battlefield. It means that he was successful in blinding our minds to keep us from realizing the importance of turning or submitting our lives to Jesus Christ. He is the light that shines in this dark world. It is fitting to end this segment by recalling this verse that Paul wrote to the Ephesians. Ephesians 6 verse 12. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. As all believers in Christ are faced with Satan's assault, we must keep in mind what we are faced with. Knowing how the enemy operates helps us win these battles. This ends our study for this segment. I pray you will join me again in our next study. If you have any question or feedback, you may email me on the email shown on the slide. This ministry is online at www.calltotruth.org. You can find a Revelation study in this website and other articles that might interest you.